Marek Poliks is an award-winning researcher in the philosophy of technology, especially with respect to deep learning. He's based in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Roberto Alonso Trillo is a Hong Kong-based theorist and artist whose interdisciplinary practice bridges music, dance, video art, and interactive sound installations. In collaboration, Marek and Roberto explore topics that range from the examination of deep learning tools as endosymbiotic reproductive infrastructure to political theory. Their work most recently won Google's prestigious Art and Machine Intelligence Award on the subject of AI interface design. After the publication of Choreomata, Performance and Performativity After AI in 2024, they're completing 2 forthcoming books on algorithmic capital, AI agents, and interfaces. Additionally, their podcast, Disintegrator, is recognized as a leading trend forecasting platform at the intersection of algorithms and media. Rumor has it that there may be more than one Marek and Roberto. This is healthy and perfectly natural.
Going good. How are you?
Yeah, good. Let me just admit Roberto. Thanks for joining in on the stream. I saw that both of you were on the comments. But yeah, really excited to have your talk today. We've just had 2 speakers this afternoon, and we can't wait to hear more from you. So just to introduce Marek and Roberto, we've just played our introduction sequence, and rumor has it that there may be more than one Marek and Roberto, so we'll let you take over on the stream, and you are now on our big screens. Oh yes, so I'm going to give you host permissions. Yes, so just a second. Cool.
How's she looking? Wow, I'm looking at myself on the stream as well. So now truly I am experiencing myself as multiple, which is awesome. Oh yeah.
Cool. Thank you so much, and feel free to start whenever, and we'll have Q&A session after as well.
Is it possible to put the deck up? Yeah. Okay. Sick. Fire. Awesome. Nice. Thank you so much. Cool. Okay. Let's do it. So talk is called How to Kill the Internet. The defense mechanisms of hyper-scaled reproductive machinery. First, just want to say thank you so much, Daniel. Thank you, Jen. Thanks this amazing department for having us at Buff. This is so sick, and it's awesome to see so many online friends and personal heroes in this context. It really rules. Okay, so let me kick this off. So we should begin by saying that we've already made a kind of academic mistake. We've said the internet, which means that we're positioning the internet as an evenly distributed or unipolar thing. But instead of capitulating and changing our wording to how to kill an internet, we'll dig in our heels, actually. There is meaningfully an identifiable array of scaling technologies, interfacial regimes, and applied computational imperatives that produce, in their aggregate, the internet, which upon its collision with our very real condition of many-worldedness freaks out and actively reformats everything it touches into a very weird, unsteady, carcinogenic material. The internet is not only the abstract, dematerialized cloud, which we think it's what it wants us to think it is, nor is the internet the same thing as online or the online, which is that, beautiful array of digital human machine social spaces, which again, it kind of lazily poofs out as a kind of camouflage, but obviously has, enormous downstream impacts on humans. So instead, we're going to borrow from the chaos magician Gordon White. We think of the internet as a reproductive organ of an ahrimanic entity that is arranging our dimension in a way that allows for more of it to enter. Or, borrowing from the artist Avocado Ibuprofen, the internet is the data production phase of something that is just now starting to speak. I want to identify the internet as something far more than a social interface, and instead as a highly physicalized armature, or even kind of inversely as a kind of anti-physical antivirus that moves both Earth and worlds around in aggressive and defensive ways. The internet is also not a component of some kind of geo-computational planetary stack. For us, the internet is not a network protocol, nor an address layer, nor is it a mode of administration. Instead, the internet is the biggest of several reproductive machines belonging to computation, all enrolling themselves recursively across many simultaneous levels. Stack, black stack, planetary computation, geocomputation, geopolitical consolidation. These feel like two ordered things for a hyperdimensional heap wherein this or that algorithmic life form crawls through and reorganizes volatile material. At best, you could consider it a kind of stacking, but a very weird kind of stacking. And I think in the context of this conference and through an understanding of fashion as the study of defensive weapons, of camouflage and reproduction maxing, in addition to aggressive weapons as well, we'd really like to talk about what the body of the internet looks like as it crawls through and reorganizes one and many heaps, especially its reproductive organs and faculties. I'm going to move my Zoom bar, which is always in the wrong place. Okay, here we go, Roberto.
So prior to the internet, the telephone system was made out of physical circuits of copper wire connecting one phone to another. Telephone A would call telephone B, and a series of switching operators in between would create the physical circuit through which information X could be exchanged. The internet reproduced with this technology, prepending addresses A and B onto all data X. Now this XAB is fragmented into datagrams, small asynchronous packets that contain information about where they go and how to put them back together. Now, instead of millions of point-to-point connections managed by switching operators, every telephone could be permanently connected to every other telephone, with all information flowing freely between them, with the understanding that only A and B, as co-participants in XAB, can decode the datagram flow of X as information. The wires and then the switching stations still existed, and the functions they executed remained actually very similar. The internet did not tear them up. Instead, it injected itself into the information conveyed through that structure. The internet, and this is very important, is very good at repurposing infrastructure into internet infrastructure. The internet also changed the meaning and content structure of information. Information can be understood here as that which is expressible within the elemental unit of the TCP/IP or UDP packet, the datagram, the XAB. Now, driving the point home, the penetration of metadata into the datagram did a thing that the humanities really hates. It barked out its defiant independence against physical media. As long as some anonymous relay system exists, and as long as that conveyance system is representable by a geography or a graph that contains XAB with a sufficient amount of resolution, the packet is independent from that infrastructure. Now, if that system is not representable by said graph, then XAB will simply kill itself. Datagram is small, usually limited to about 1,500 bytes. Anything bigger than that is usually fragmented, no, usually it's fragmented and blasted through the internet, collected, buffered, and reconstituted in order at a destination computer. Again, the agency of the physical medium is limited to its completeness as geography. It does not possess a kind of qualitative agency, apart, if you want, from the phenomenon of choppiness, for example, which is ultimately delivered by an end computer's buffer emptying, not strictly by the physical medium itself. Now, let us zoom out a level. Prior to the internet, the nation-state telephone grid represented another kind of point-to-point architecture. France Telecom operated French phones. Deutsche Telekom operated German phones, and they connected to each other through different treaties and agreements. The internet converted the nation-state grid into internet infrastructure. Those national operators did not disappear. They just lost their sovereignty. Those entities became general utilities within a hierarchy at a larger scale, dominated by emergent hyper-sovereign conglomerates like AT&T, Telefonica, or Orange. The next level up involved the same transformation. Each of those conglomerates became general utilities through generalized peering agreements. Even the transatlantic cables that originally functioned as point-to-point networks between countries received the same treatment. First purchased by hyper-sovereign telcos, and now by hyper-sovereign technology multinationals like Google or Meta. Now, because of the internet's capacity to repurpose existing infrastructure as its own, multiple managerial overlays can leverage the same infrastructure at the same time. As Andrew Blum puts it turns out that the internet has a kind of depth. Multiple networks run through the same wires. One company might own the actual fiber optic cables, while another company operates the light signals pulsing over that fiber, and a third company could own the bandwidth encoded in that light. This recursive isn't just vertical, it's very parallel as well. Now, you could call into question the idea that the internet overrides the sovereignty of the nation state. You could point at China's Great Firewall or Russia's RUNET. But balkanized internets are still the internet. I mean, is there a non-balkanized internet out there? The Chinese internet identifies itself as distinct by adding managerial overlays that interfere with an unprivileged user's claim to its addressedness within information. You can remove people from the internet without threatening the internet. Now, the tension between these overlays and the very much alive internet that flows through supposedly balkanized infrastructure is impactful, precisely because of just how connected these internets are. It is impossible to argue, we believe, that the infrastructure of the Chinese internet is not a constructive force through which the internet itself is taught.
Okay, so we're kind of zooming up a technical level here, but this is kind of a technical talk, but it'll get really philosophy and pointed towards the end. I want to think about this cascade of examples as a kind of reproductive envelope. It's abstract, but you can think of it as a kind of like RNA code for how the internet works at a bunch of different scales at the same time. So the internet takes nodes, like real places, like real places, real addresses that are distinct from each other in some way, and it virtualizes them into a graph. Imagine a kind of point-to-point tree like you see here on the left side, where there exist these like discrete places, A and B, and they're connected by that line X, where you have information flowing from one to the other. The fundamental reproductive unit operation of the internet is actually to go to the right and identify the coordinate position XAB within a graph. And in doing so, the nodes, these points of difference, have been subordinated to the line, to the information, which has been encoded with its own spatial position as a relation between A and B. So XAB is no longer a line connecting two nodes. It's actually an address within a coordinate system. And you can continue to apply this operation to itself over and over again, and simultaneously in parallel, transforming graphs into hypergraphs that at some stage you might arrive at a single supercoordinate that contains all information. So just drawing the stages of this kind of RNA operation or reproductive envelope. So first there's a project that we call capture, where the connections within a node tree are transformed from information into addressed information. Infrastructure is taken over and repurposed by information. Then there's a process called propagation, where nodes that once were these distinct things that have like lost their localization are repurposed to circulate the unaddressed conveyance of addressed information or material. And then there's a process that we call management, which consists of the protocols through which addressed information is decoded into regimes of access. It's abstract, but we're going to keep exemplifying this until it makes sense.
Now, something we find interesting is how the internet is not dependent on one physical medium. You think, copper wire, fiber, transatlantic cables, 5G cells. The internet actually turns all physical infrastructure into internet infrastructure. Everything that touches the internet is a convenience medium for the internet. From emergency services spinning out satellite networks, big industries setting up LoRaWAN meshes and 5G towers, and of course, humans, who are at the end of the day, just roving, stateless propagation machines for GNSS, BLE, Wi-Fi, and 5G technologies around the world. And of course, you can see the reproductive effects of the internet on humans, de-physicalized into platform avatars according to a stealth phrenology of standards and archetypes. Our roots into our own bodies shunted through digital architecture. Our workspaces and social spheres also de-physicalized and de-differentiated into basically identical virtual environments, and so on. You can think of this indifference to physical media as a defense mechanism. A nodeless graph is invulnerable to node-based attacks. Bonding an interchange station or cutting a transatlantic cable might create, some level of momentary small-scale turbulence, but every station or cable is fungible with every other accessible station or cable. The internet is therefore robustly infrastructured. Its vulnerabilities are somewhere else.
Okay. The internet also infects code in this particular way. If you execute code on your own computer, your own laptop somewhere that's running without an internet connection, there's something special about that, something kind of traditional, right? It has a kind of localness to it. It's in a local environment, so to speak. And you can think of the sum of local environments as a kind of node tree, different computers with their own special, specific, hardware and runtime differences in different locations doing different things. But again, the internet is not, as we see it, a networking technology, strictly speaking. It's a design principle that contaminates through proximity and it leaks through borders. The internet has thoroughly contaminated, put whatever valence on it as you wish. It's affected software engineering, replacing the local with the general at every instance. The local kind of only appears at the final moment where your computer does the thing, and all the kind of transistors are engaged and it appears. So back to the local environment, contemporary software development. I don't know how many people in the audience code, but those of you who do probably spend less of your time coding than assembling pre-written code made by other people, delivered by management tools like NPM or pip, for example, over the internet into your computer. This is a form of standardization and genericization. A script moves from a node, a single thing that you made, to a schematic, to a coordinate within a graph. There was a comment earlier about the democratization of code. The democratization of access to code is the platformization of code, the construction and inlaying of dependencies into code. And I want to be clear, it doesn't make code better, whatever that means. It does make code easier, which is great. It makes code more standardized, which is complicated. And it also makes code way more complex, scaled up, and often absolutely illogical, kind of cancerous and weird. If you go up a level, this is where things start to get really funky. The pattern is repeated. So software dependencies are constantly breaking. And if you want to run your script, your piece of code that you made on someone else's computer, there's almost always a problem, at least on the instance. You need everything in order to make that code do its thing to be installed, right? You need all the dependencies to be there in their own specific configuration. So over the last 15 years, there's become a practice where in order to mitigate the contingencies of the local as represented by this or that specific computer, you actually put the runtime, the operating system of code, within itself, in the construct that's called a software container. You can expect every software container to run the same way. And again, you're kind of packing metadata into information, just like in that datagram example. And this gets, you can see the kind of layers start to build. So much like the depth of fiber optic cable that Roberto was talking about, like an individual computer or a server within a data center, each one can be subcontracted into many computers, right? With individual cores or threads or partitions running different parallel software containers. That dynamic process of subleasing computational space across multiple computers is called container orchestration. You don't own those computers. You don't really know where they are. Your code is completely deracinated from the idea of a physical local. If the data center gets set on fire or something kind of truly awful happens to that data center, the orchestration tool will just move that container elsewhere, basically. So most container orchestration is done through services provided by geographically anonymous hypersovereign service providers like Amazon Web Services, AWS. These compute providers are so hyper-sovereign that they actually create new geographies called regions or availability zones based on things like power on fiber optic routes and latency requirements. A company in Singapore might actually be more tightly coupled or digitally proximate to AWS's Tokyo region than to infrastructure in neighboring Malaysia. Move up a level. You don't generally interact with something like AWS directly, but instead you use another software layer deployed in kind of the self-same way to automate and script AWS EKS instances. If anyone here knows what an EKS instance, we have to talk. That like we're really simpatico in terms of enterprise platform solutions. But you're automating essentially this thing that's automating the deployment of containers, which automate their own kind of running of software that's sitting within them through their own contained runtimes. So you have these containers that are kind of fizzling in and out of anonymous, geographically ambiguous servers, kind of like quantum foam. This practice is a permutation of the same defense mechanism from earlier. So nested protocols like package management and containerization, they move risk profiles both higher into like management layers and deeper into code. And at the same time, code, which remains the kind of central interface composite that mediates this entire infrastructure, is kind of everywhere and nowhere. It belongs to nobody. It's written kind of by everybody, and it's compacted into massively recursive sheaves that grow in entanglement and complexity. Every nested management layer concentrates brittleness at higher and more catastrophic levels. If AWS goes down, the internet goes down. If Kubernetes gets overloaded, you can't access OpenAI for a day. If a software library used by everybody has a vulnerability, everybody has a vulnerability.
Let us return to the node tree. When the internet creates XAB by embedding A and B into X, it also needs to create and circulate that aggregate coordinate geography. Every graph within the internet is constantly rewriting and sharing its own coordinate geography through the autonomous and asynchronous tides of propagation. Because the anonymized relay media of the internet is so diverse, and because the complexity of the information that moves through it is so multiply ordered, the internet requires a policy of implicit deference within the relay swarm and upstream to its management structure. Now, once a propagation mechanism is engaged by a management structure, like a DNS record update or a Kubernetes schedule change, the new coordinate geography is accepted and distributed through the relay system. Trust is always allocated upward, often horizontally, but never downward. If we think about the Border Gateway Protocol, or BGP, this is one type of map of the internet. It really literally maps the physical infrastructure of servers and service providers across the globe. This physical infrastructure is always changing. Consequently, its map, as defined by BGP, is always dynamic, with many simultaneous remappings circulating asynchronously throughout the relay system. As before, anything underneath BGP trusts BGP, absolutely. BGP trusts BGP, absolutely as well. But there is no underlying accountability infrastructure. After all, if there was, the system would be insufficiently dynamic. As a result, anyone can rewrite BGP as they please, announcing themselves as actually the correct path to Credit Suisse or Barclays, and traffic will reroute itself accordingly until management intervenes. Move up a few levels and you'll see similar dynamic cartographers, like DNS or the maps made by the content delivery networks. Move laterally and you'll find that propagation is embedded into almost all software architecture. Now, if you think about it, the last 25 years of media theory is all about platforms. But it feels like few people talk about the thousands of swarming microservices that serve as a platform's logistical and ontological basis. Every single point of contact between a user and a platform, say, for example, a customer checkout card, consists of a microservice swarm engaging, we have these services engaging with each other autonomously. For example, a payment processor, an authentication service, and a graphical user interface. Each microservice dependent on asynchronous output from another species of microservice and on rules handed to it from upstream command. The rise of AI agents, for example, to take into account a more recent example, compounds this architecture to an extreme level, replacing the content of a container with an instance of a model, de-speciating each microservice and replacing them with clones assigned to different tasks. Now, the thing to remember about propagation is a key term, is trust. Microservices trust their management layer absolutely. Servers trust their orchestrators. Modems trusts the ICPs. There are some nuances here when it comes to security architecture, and we can discuss this later on the Q&A. So TLDR, the internet trusts upstream. It wants to assume a secondary level of trust laterally, and it categorically does not trust downstream. It certainly does not trust you. That's propagation.
Okay, so now getting into like the why and the very unfortunate how of how to kill the internet. I mean I really do think that the internet is like deeply antagonistic design or antagonistic fashion, let's put it that way, and should be understood as structurally problematic. And like this is a real question that a lot of people are talking about right now, mostly proposed by AI doomer psychos like Leopold Aschenbrenner or Blake Lemoine or Eliezer Yudkowsky, but to me, it's more of like a design or fashion problem with implications for the kinds of things that we allow ourselves to think and build. There's a lot of thinking about how to make war with the physical infrastructure of the internet, like, bombing an interchange station, cutting beach transatlantic cables, or, annihilating a couple of the thousand or so root servers around the world. And you can find all of their addresses and do what you like, I suppose. But this is kind of insufficiently scaled war making. And there's also a discourse about using platforms against themselves, obviously, or using some very good software platforms. Everyone's on Blue Sky now that somehow undermine some very bad software platforms. And this feels kind of profoundly limited to, a social layer that the internet is relatively indifferent to, despite its effects on it. We're obviously much less interested in killing vital infrastructure, of course, than we are in the thought experiment of killing the germ, the RNA, the idea, the design decision that spins up tumescent, empty, precarious structures all over the place. Killing the internet is a design decision in as much as it is also a kind of war making with a wild strain of applied computation. So why kill the internet? It's bad design in its capacity to kill us at scale, like for real. It's intractable invasion into our skulls, fingers, medicine, food, and dreams, for better or for worse. And it's obsessive restructuration of everything around it into hypergraph format. So I want to talk about the risks, because obviously there's benefits here, but we know what they are. The risks are big, though. So the first design failure of the internet is obvious. It's what we call concentration. The internet doesn't distribute risk, it concentrates risk. The only kind of risk is catastrophic risk, and catastrophic failures happen with greater regularity, an inverse correlation to a decrease in localized failures. I mean, I don't know if you follow tech news, but like it seems like the internet is just like falling apart and shutting down in its entirety, like wide swaths of it, because of this centralization of risk. And it's a mistake, I think, to consider managerial objects with major dependencies, those big baddies like telecom or Meta or Google, for example, as invulnerable mechanical monopolies. Social and political theory loves to point at a technology multinational and say, this is a monolithic object with concentrated and directed agency. It's a unilaterally hyperscale bad actor motivated by capitalism or surveillance politics, and it's totally ready and able to execute. And it's funny how it's like kind of controversial to talk about the internet, but it's not controversial to talk about the capitalism or the fascist nation state. But in reality, an object at the scale of AT&T or Deutsche Telekom or Alibaba is a mess. It is a porous coral shell through which vastly differentiated media suffer through their ambiguation into media for hyperscale. AT&T, woof, it's a blurry swarm of partnerships, dark fiber, dark telephony intermediaries, data centers, legacy computation, literally built into the disintegrating nuclear bunkers of Bell. It places a tremendously mind-blowing amount of load and pressure on the capacity of the protocol to shape itself, AT&T, into some kind of thing, into some kind of actual entity. It's literally actively falling apart live in a way that's actually really threatening. here's I think one of the biggest critiques is that like the internet forces us to think about everything immediately at scale. Even this presentation, like this is the metastatic axiom of the internet. There is no one, there's just n. And it becomes really, really difficult and explicitly impractical to build simple things. And in turn, to think about anything local or small as real or important or of value. That's a big problem. The internet is also catastrophically ahistorical, or rather amemorial, and that's by design, not because it's incapable of storing information, but because of the trust hierarchy between command and propagation. So if you change something to a software deployment, you're not storing that change as like a kind of cache at the container level. Those containers are wiped, like they're just killed, they're slaughtered, and then they're replaced. Any records are stored at the command level, which critically is the deployment level of another higher order command level. The only temporal procedure available to the internet is the overwrite. At the same time, while the internet is always archiving relationships that bear some kind of resemblance to historicity, that historical record is super weird and manifestly artificial, if we can call something historical as artificial. Obviously that's loaded, but there's a kind of pseudo history that's constructed and generated by the structure. If you like, the example would be, take a look at a dependency tree and you'll find this like crazy weird archive that has nothing to do with memory or history, with a whole bunch of like accidental connections that are preserved for reasons that are completely unaccountable, whose situatedness is incomplete and illegible and like impossible to take apart. And since I'm talking about the archive, I hope it's clear to this group that like Web3, I don't know how Web3 pilled this group is, but like that's an intensification of internet architecture, profound centralization of protocol at the expense of the local, enmeshed dependencies, completely vertical trust environment, temporal conflict between the decontextualized and immutable archive of the ledger, which can get like overwritten by smart contract upgrades and forks. And all of this, I mean, the irony here is that all of it lives and circulates and depends on traditional cloud providers and existing internet infrastructure. And then the biggest problem is that of unilateral dependency. The internet converts infrastructure into internet infrastructure. Infrastructure becomes dependent upon the internet. If infrastructure cannot access the internet, it shuts down and it becomes inoperable. But that threat doesn't move both ways, or at least it's seriously incommensurate upstream. It would require seriously major, globally distributed swaths of infrastructure to fail for tremendous amounts of time, creating major human pain in order to place the internet itself under threat by forcing the kind of simultaneous revision of multiple protocol levels. How to kill the internet? World War. That's how to do it. Primarily through the power plays between geographic and virtual sovereignty that play themselves out at multiple kind of simultaneous scales, through which infrastructure would need to become violently decoupled from internet infrastructure. A world war, I think, would ultimately, in its primary form, represent a war against the internet. I can't think of another way to kill the internet outright, which is personally devastating.
Now, with any piece of reproductive media, there exists an interesting question. Who is reproducing with whom? In an endosymbiotic relationship, an organism takes residence within another organism, transforming the aggregate into a more complex organism. You can think about the first aerobic bacterium forming from the ingestion of one bacterium by another, and the transformation of the former into an organ for the latter. In a retroviral infection, a virus moves through a host and reorganizes its genetic mapping. Like the development of the placental mammal from the egg-laying lizard through retroviral gene jacking. This seems like an accurate description of what we're going through. But in this case, who is host to whom? Who came first, it doesn't really matter, yeah? Does a virus come before a lizard? Does that even make sense? The question of bigness might be relevant in the case of bacterial encapsulation, but who is bigger in the case of a machine-human assemblage? Who is gene jacking who? It might be better in this case to see, this particular reproductive relationship as meiotic or sexual, while also mutually parasitic. Two categories of being have entangled themselves both through physical media and through distinct manners and modes of thought, scrambling this genetic material through coextensive formats and building the co-inhabited world according to the logics of those genetics. We're here today, already several generations children of this transplanar exchange, And killing the internet would be a kind of patricide in addition to a suicide. The question then is, what else is out there for us to reproduce with? What other wild strains of computations can our aggregate enfold into its body that might contain or rewrite our acquired genetic disposition toward architectural cancer? Thank you very much.
Hi, sorry, I'm just returning to the stage. Thank you so much for the presentation. You've definitely touched on, I mean, for the next unit for these MA students we are exploring the kind of like deeper side of the internet in relation to neural media. And I think your talk really kind of demystifies a lot of the kind of technical, obviously infrastructure dependencies that we engage with that we don't see on the surface level. So first of all, maybe I'll open up the floor to any questions, if you have any. If not, I've got quite a few. I think this morning I woke up with one of my colleagues' Instagram stories. It's by this artist, Most Dismal Swamp. His name is Dane Sutherland, and he wrote that the dead internet is a design feature of the internet and not a bug. And I think
I saw that post and responded to it like so fucking true, like exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Sorry. Please continue. I love that post. Shout out to Most Dismal Swamp. Yeah.
Yeah. I was just like, oh, this is a perfect kind of presentation response to here's a whole breakdown for why the vulnerabilities, vulnerabilities are the kind of like design of the internet. But I think we're also, I mean, sitting in this room, we have a stream set up that has a whole hardware to software kind of like software and drivers and actually fiber optic cables in this room that's allowing for the stream to happen at this very moment. And we have created a kind of microservice swarm ourselves. I think one thing I'm quite interested in towards the end of the presentation is around, you have mentioned how the internet is constantly ingesting itself, and it has this parasitic kind of quality in terms of our relationship with it, and it's also kind of living rent-free. Culturally speaking, you've also mentioned the kind of Chinese internet. We have quite a lot of Chinese students here in this room as well. One kind of concept I've been really interested in is the idea of involution, and lots of Chinese students call it neijuan, meaning like the cycle. It's the persisting kind of toxic cycle. Without the World War proposal. What are some kind of like interesting observations you have seen on the internet right now that is trying to escape this type of kind of like self-eating process? Do you see any hope rather than just the World War of destroying the internet?
I mean, we could. There's a bunch of things here. Maybe the first thing I'd love to just very briefly touch on is Most Dismal Swamp's post about the dead internet, which I really loved, where he basically literally spoke directly to the involution problem. Essentially, he was like, I wish I had the post pulled up, but it was essentially like the dead internet is you, like the fact that all of us are living some kind of highly archetyped, templated sort of life, and that we're all kind of tired, and like, and the fact that like, if we fail our own kind of Turing test, if like our own behavior on Instagram or especially like LinkedIn, for example, is totally you can't tell it apart from a bot, then like that's like the dead internet is our kind of death inside the internet, not the internet being dead. It's as someone posted in the chat, like the internet's living in the moment. It's happy as a clam. Like it's really living. Yeah. Then the question about I mean, Roberto, do you want to add anything about like involution and the kind of phenomenology of, I don't know, exhaustion with the internet? I don't know. And then we could talk about World War.
No, I think what you said makes perfect sense. Yeah, that's how I feel as well. I mean, there were a bunch of questions in there. That was
Yeah.
starting point. Um,
I
then I
was,
think
yeah.
with regards, sorry,
No, go for it. Go.
you said something. The death of the internet alternatives. I think again, Mark might disagree here. Um, like it's a matter of framings, and it's a matter of how you approach the internet. If you approach the internet through your engagement with it, which is how we usually do it, that's one possible engagement. If you want to go beyond the anthropocentric approach and think about it as a kind of a design principle, and I think that's one of the ways that Marek defined it, then it becomes a bit more complicated because once you redesign a design, it becomes something else. And maybe I may be wrong here, but that's, if you think at least the way I'm looking at it. So the question that we were trying to, I think, portray to some extent today is to what extent this design is escapable, and to what extent can it be morphed, and to what extent it's a dead end, like there's nothing that can be done about it. And we're fighting against something that goes down to the root of the design itself, the design, infrastructural level of what the internet actually is. And yes, that's where I think, Marek reached that conclusion of World War, and that's probably not an ideal situation. So we might have to think of all designs.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's the point, right? Like that it's maybe less about, sui generis, like coming up with a design that's better. I don't know if that's the solution. But to Roberto's kind of section at the end, like it's a matter of identifying other ways that we can kind of pollute or on what's the kind of genetic word to mutate, right? Like the kind of shared DNA through some kind of foreign RNA injection to reconstruct the aggregate in some kind of productive way. I feel like that's what we do. Like, it's controversial to say that we live in like a universe of very kind of large forces, and I think we do. Like, I think there are some very large forces, or rather, like bigness or smallness is kind of irrelevant, but there are kind of other paradigms that exist within something like computation that could be theoretically injected in such a way that it would cause the kind of aggregate to mutate. But I think we're taking the internet with us, I think is kind of the point. It's less about like the internet feels unkillable, like a virus is unkillable, right? A virus is just a kind of information. It's like an idea. The question is like, what other viruses could we expose ourselves to, I think.
And I guess with mutation and designs, we also have kind of antibiotics and kind of different reactions to these antibiotics. So it's an interesting mutation to watch. Apart from my questions, are there any questions from the floor? Yeah, from Daniel.
Hi. I guess my question, off the back of what you just said, I guess I have like a lot of thoughts about it. I guess in relation to this, the idea of kind of neural media being this thing that may be, from a sort of potentially sort of optimistic or potential sort of optimistic or kind of to it as a term would be this recognition that obviously one option is to destroy it, like the internet. Like I know that we've talked about it before, but a massive influence to me is this the work of Catherine Malibu with this notion of like plasticity, and she always refers to these like three aspects to plasticity, being the kind of giving of form and the taking of form, but also the destruction of all form. And she refers to this notion of the accident as this kind of one aspect of plasticity, which is this kind of the ability for the thing, the organism or whatever it is, to be almost like absolutely kind of destroyed through an accident, and whatever that would be. Within the kind of neuroscience context, it would be through like a brain lesion or some kind of like accident to the brain or whatever. But in most cases you don't want that to happen. Like that's or that's very dramatic, right, and very significant. And I guess like another way would be to find ways to remap or reorganize that or reform that thing with that organism. And I guess I was thinking of the work of the deep historian Daniel Smale, who in his book The Deep History of the Brain, I think it's called, he refers to, so he does this kind of like, he charts the history of kind of humanity through the changes in the human brain. And one of the things that he highlights is this notion of sort of addiction. And he says that kind of like, the human species is kind of programmed to be an addictive organism or an addictive kind of species. So this kind of idea of just sort of like removing, like seeing addiction as a problem that we can somehow solve or we can just get rid of, from his perspective is like that's a ahistoric understanding. We have to understand the human organism as an addictive organism, and his then claim is that the task then is to create new kinds of addictions, addictions that may be more positive or more in line with our general sort of well-being and etc. So I guess it was like just thinking about kind of maybe neuromedia is this kind of moment where we could start to think of the internet not as this absolutely fixed thing, but as something that does have, in its sheer messiness and its sheer jankiness and its sheer whatever, like it has this scope to be able to kind of be reformed in some way. And maybe I was just off the back of that, I was just thinking, you mentioned this kind of, in its current structure, it's totally dependent on this trust between the different layers, I guess. I guess maybe part of the task would be to think of new forms of trust, or is there new ways in which we can construct what trust means, either between ourselves or between ourselves and these systems? So it's not much of a question, but I guess, yeah.
No, I think what you're proposing is something that obviously we're very much aligned with, right? I think the whole idea of proposing the internet in this way is to kind of identify it as some kind of germinal motion, so that we can therefore see how it ripples and moves through a whole bunch of different scales, and understand how structural problems manifest through actually kind of very small processes, and how and like certainly I'm very much aligned with the principle of the idea that something like neural media could be a kind of RNA gene check that we could allow into the composite, and to think of it actually less of a emergent property of this particular type of infrastructure. Though, I mean, it also could very much be an emergent property of this type of infrastructure. I'm thinking about a particular graph where broadcast media is identified, and you have this kind of point-to-point architecture, and then you have a translation to all-to-all architecture at the core of neural media, which is very, very much kind of what we're talking about in terms of a relationship between points, or rather an embedding of a protocol into information. But I think like questions of what do we do about it, or questions of human agency. I love, there's a quote by Banya Kanyar I wish I had off the top of my mind, which is like, what do we do about it is always kind of not her favorite question to answer. Like, what do we do about it being already a kind of, I guess, a reversion to a certain kind of, trained response, which is totally reasonable. And like, I want to do something about it. Like, I'm not a personal fan of the internet, even though it's obviously penetrated like every aspect of my existence. But I would say that it would be interesting. Let me put it this way. It would be interesting to think of our agency with respect to something as both kind of singular and also small and also very big as the internet, not being something that is direct, but something that we would mediate through intercession with other forces. Perhaps one of those being neural media. I'm not entirely sure.
Yeah, I agree with Marek. I think the way we wanted to present today, I think we wanted to be, discuss the internet as an idea, but also kind of factual approach to what it actually is. So looking at these different levels and layers of what's going on from the kind of physical dimension of how it's built at an infrastructural level to the different protocols that are involved, and how the whole thing is kind of structured. And I think there is a level of entanglement right now between the internet and us that would make the end of an internet, as we were pointed out, a kind of suicidal move. Maybe neural media, in a way, is a form of, as Mark was proposing, of gene jacking that could potentially modify the thing. But I think we also have to keep looking back at how the internet is structured and to what extent it can be modified from within. Yes, what level of gene jacking would be necessary to modify some elements that are actually kind of foundational, and if that's possible, it might become something else. So yes, I mean, there's a historical element to development of the internet that is really interesting that I think has to be taken into account. We tend to normalize these kind of things as a given. The internet is just the internet. It's the internet. It's just, but I think we have to keep looking at them critically. Yeah.
I'm really interested because I know both of you are obsessed with scale, and I wanted to ask more about scale, but of a smaller scale. Both Daniel and I have been really interested in the kind of, especially been really in love with your super lecture on Nobody Listens to Music Anymore. I think is that the full title? Yes, and there's this concept, just for context for students, that there's also the argument that music is just a big stream, and also that we're mostly listening to the algorithm and not so much to kind of fix albums as we know it. There's so much more on the super lecture that I really recommend everyone to watch. But one thing that was a major takeaway for me, and that we're both really interested in, is how the use of content for this addictive user can also change the way we engage with the platform altogether. And I guess our mutation does come from a different type of neural content that allows the users to be less of shadows of themselves, and thinking and changing perspectives. This is a completely irrelevant branch, but also from the kind of presentation you had, there's a lot of views of the functional analysis of the internet does come from this kind of macro scale, hyperdimensional graph kind of representation of the internet. I'm really interested to what the view would look like when it comes from the stream view, or how would you see the internet through the stream that's happening right now? Sorry, it was a shit question, but I'm thinking of any responses would be great.
That's a great question. I mean, you guys are, you and Daniel are both obviously foundational parts of that lecture in a lot of respects. It was, Roberto and I's conversation with you on our podcast in December that in no small way inspired me to get to work on that. I think or November, I guess. I think so part of the lecture that I think is interesting is there's a proposition that the way that the music industry has changed music, which we do see as part of the organ of internet aim. It's become redesignated from local activity full of difference into a kind of all to all kind of relationship where you have a kind of total archive of all of music ever. And there's an interesting kind of parallel there where maybe actually that's what music is. Maybe music is actually a kind of all human exercise that has been kind of traced with obviously a ton of difference, throughout its history and throughout its development, but is a kind of anonymized codex that we all kind of participate within as humans. And maybe the internet has kind of shown us back how to see things that way. And there's something quite beautiful about it. I'm thinking a lot about Carnatic music or Byzantine classical music, for example, as Certainly, there are significant composers and there's significant practices that diverge and break, but there is a sense of contribution to a codex, which I think is something that we kind of lost in a sort of maybe in one specific way in a kind of post-Enlightenment Western conception of the subject as like individual who does something important at the local scale and like they really matter and their immediate phenomenology is the thing that's important and their career experience is the thing that's important. And the internet has kind of actually reflected back to us another practice that's maybe more deeply embedded. I don't know, which is this idea of like the music as the all human thing. The point that I make though is that it's beautiful, like there's something really nice about that, but it also comes with some real problems, specifically around history, because in order to assemble music into the all human thing, in order to put it into a position where you can access like massive, like I would say they're just in thinking about in terms of actual product, like the majority of performed music. I mean, you certainly can access it through a cloud provider, right? And that cloud provider has all kinds of business interests and they're, evil in their own specific ways. But it's the format to me that is where the real problem happens, where this music has to be kind of compacted in some way, and it loses very meaningfully its relationship to history. The all human music thing is like a deeply ahistoricized kind of object. Everything is kind of set into relationship with everything else, which is true, but is also without that component of memory. And yeah, I should say memory instead of history. I really do kind of mean memory, I think. So like that creates all kinds of problems. It creates problems with like IP becomes like a complicated thing, for example, where in that particular lecture, I'm one of the people who argues that artists should care a little bit less about IP, while at the same time recognizing the problem that if you don't care about your personal relationship, your personal contribution to that codex, it's very easy for the kind of structural imbalances in our political and social world to manifest themselves like really extra strongly, right? Like that's one problem. You get credit. It's very easy to steal the work of another less privileged individual and claim it as your own, for example. Conversely, you also kind of lose, to a certain extent, these massive singular profiles of individual artists as like romantic subject heroes who, by virtue of the kind of transcendental practice that they're engaged with, in quotes, are, for whatever reason, typically associated with, whiteness and masculinity also. So like it's like it's a very complicated double-edged sword that I think is really interesting, but it does allow us to see things in a different way. And so returning all the way back to your point, like, yeah, the internet absolutely does allow us to see each other in a very different way and allows us to see ourselves in a very different way. In a book that we wrote now about a year and a half ago, there's a proposal that like there is the opportunity for a kind of uncanny partial like solidarity of like parts of ourselves with parts of other people in a way that we haven't had before, because we're all kind of swirling in this gametic reproductive vortex where all humans, I mean, for the most part, all humans are coupled to each other, obviously with all kinds of provisions about the ways that they're coupled and the access that they have. But there's this kind of, global coupling where all kinds of uncanny solidarities can occur at levels that we wouldn't even recognize from a conventional subject or Western post-Enlightenment subject position. Sorry, that was a long answer. I apologize.
Roberto, did you have anything to add? Otherwise, we have a question from the floor, but it's okay for me to pass the mic.
Hello. So the kind of history you're talking about is also, in a sense, like a temporal localism, right, where things can happen in that way. And I just wanted to ask you to talk more about what you meant when you said memory, specifically in the context of the earlier in the slides and in the context of that answer right there. Thank you.
Yeah. Roberto, do you want to speak to that? Or I would speak to, there's like a quote, I just want to pull it up so I can read it in its entirety because I think it's really lovely. Wait. I'm not an expert on history and memory as different things.
I didn't fully get that. I think my connection might have dropped a little bit.
Well, the quote that I'm referring to is by Wendy Huikang Chun from Updating to Remain the Same.
Yeah.
It's like there's this idea that storage, for example, is something that you can place within an organ, right? Like a brain can store something. Thinking about Thomas Moynihan, for example, like the spine could be a kind of storage mechanism, or the brain could be a storage mechanism, or a physical hard drive could be a storage mechanism. And that's different from history and different from memory, I think, in a way that's really meaningful. I am history and memory, like memory, obviously, I think theoretically being a kind of making sense of history or a kind of reflexive looking back at history. I don't know. I would really kind of trouble to parse those out as really separate. I think what I really mean is memory, but I don't know. Do you have a specific valence or understanding of those two concepts in a really nice differentiated way? Because maybe that'll help me tease out a little bit more what I mean.
I didn't get
Again, not an
actually,
expert.
I didn't get the question. So
Oh yeah, okay.
what was the question? Can you repeat it to me, Marek? Or
I
Jen?
think the person who spoke might repeat it.
Yeah, do you have the microphone?
Okay.
They have a very lovely voice.
Thanks. I mean, I just wanted to understand what, like, the specific way that you were using memory in the answer that you gave before and also earlier in the slide, what it was that you thought memory was doing, like the way the world was functioning for you. Because I wasn't sure I totally picked up what that was, and I just wanted to understand, how that was functioning specifically in the context of your thing, rather than, I guess, like get a general definition, if that makes sense.
I think when I look at something like a dependency tree, for example, like let's say I'm trying to make a Python script work somewhere. The constellation, like the temporal thing, the temporal matrix of my computer's runtime, this like aggregated series of packages with their own kind of, let's say, histories or whatever, their own kind of temporal assignations. Like the thing that is put together in the context of code is to me missing a kind of sense making or a kind of narrativizing or even a kind of like raw sequentiality that I would associate with like linear fucking time. Like that's the level of like time messiness that I think occurs at the level of code, which I think is transplanted really throughout the internet. I mean, it's missing context, right? Like that's really the thing that's missing. It's like a kind of, you have decontextualized storage, right? You have a decontextualized assemblage. Sorry, Roberto, please.
No, I think that makes sense, Mark. I mean, there's that sense of time, human time versus machinic time, the phenomenological experience time versus the time of the machines. Even if you think about 24/7 capitalism and so on, there's a lot of discourse on that, on how capitalism tends to assume machinic time as a standard increasingly. And I think when we think about storage and memory is used in a more kind of anthropocentric, if you want, approach. We recently had a discussion where someone, defined life as matter of developing purpose, and how that happens through memory. Like memory is not also only a kind of retrospective engagement with stored elements, but also projective relationship with environment that is situated, and awareness of a complexity of different elements that are playing out and so on. And that's something that is not happening in the case of storage. Storage, in a way, there remains kind of dead. It's very vertical, if you want, and it's a matter of being able to access the right part of that storage, then to engage with it. It's not something that is articulating as this kind of whole that we have to live through. That is kind of painful, as our engagement as humans with reality. And in the case of, there was another term in there, I think, beyond memory and storage. There was a third element, was there?
History.
And history to me is the narrativization of memory. So history, when we engage with that kind of term, there is a narrative that is linked usually to a specific situated understanding of how things should or should not be. So that's why the idea of history, when we discuss the internet or technological, time machines, becomes complicated, if you want.
Something this might just be the last comment. Are we running out of time? Sorry. Daniel and I were chatting about this memory/time problem around the Y2K problem and the 2038. Around how computers display time is also this problem of memory, where we don't have the right kind of memory structures for us to display and figure out time and the chips that we're dependent on. So yeah, is interesting. Nothing cool to add there, but we just thought yeah, that might be relevant. Any final comments from Daniel? Thank you both so much for coming on to the Buff Summit. Very successful day one. And fun fact, every speaker mentioned the word either Byzantine or Ottoman. Big fun fact for me. So
That's amazing.
it's a good history thing to remember. But I'll revisit those words on the stream multiple times later tonight. But yeah, thank you both so much for coming on. And tomorrow we have another an amazing lineup of speakers. So feel free to tune in if you're watching on YouTube. Tomorrow at 2-ish, we have Elizabeth Gabriel-Lee, and at 3 we have Ruba Al-Swil that we've heavily discussed on the podcast, and at 4 we have Maya B. Chronic. Thank you so much for joining us. And finally, at 5 we'll have Kay Alado McDowell joining us. So if you're watching online, please remember it's London, UK time. Thank you so much, and yeah, can't thank you both enough for joining today. But yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye. I don't need